The first thing I noticed about her was that she was not afraid of the K. That alone should have told me everything. Every species at Orion University was afraid of the KTH. They stood nearly 3 m tall with layered hide the color of old iron and forearms built like cargo lifters. When a KE walked down a corridor, every other student moved to the edges of the hallway without even thinking about it. It was not a conscious decision. It was the kind of deep biological understanding that said, do not be in the path of that thing. She did not move. She was standing near the vending machines on the east side of the main building when I first saw her. Small even by human standards, she wore a large gray hoodie that was slightly too big for her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back. She was eating something wrapped in a crinkled paper package, and her eyes were tracking a group of cadets who were walking loudly through the corridor, shoving smaller students out of the way without a second glance. She was not pressed against the wall. She was not looking down. She was just watching them, patient, the way you watch something when you are not worried about it seeing you back. My name is Zakiel. I am Vithrani, which means I have 4 limbs, 2 of which are primarily used for walking and 2 which are useful for carrying things or expressing mild discomfort, which I was doing a great deal of at that particular moment. My bioluminescent patches, which run along my neck and the outer edge of my upper arms, were glowing a pale, cautious amber. My species' version of saying without words, I would very much like to be somewhere else. It was my first week at Orion University, a coalition institution that accepts students from 38 recognized species. The campus sits on a neutral orbital platform above a mid-tier system whose star is too small to be interesting and too stable to be dangerous. It is in almost every way the perfect place to study. I was there for xenobiology. I had spent 3 years preparing my application, 6 months on the waiting list, and approximately 47 hours on the transport vessel reading the student orientation document, which described the campus as a place of mutual respect and interspecies cooperation. The KET cadet shoved a Sullivan student so hard into the wall that his spine plates rattled. Mutual respect, I thought. Interspecies cooperation. I found my room. I found the xenobiology building. I attended the orientation lecture, which was delivered by a Havel professor named Elder Duckett, who had 7 eyes, a voice like soft gravel, the quiet manner of someone who had seen a great many things and decided long ago not to be surprised by any of them. He told us the lab assignments had been posted. He told us that partners were non-negotiable. He told us with what I would later understand was very deliberate emphasis that we should approach our assigned partner with open minds. My assigned partner was Mara Solis. I looked her up in the student directory before I found her. The coalition database entry for humans was not long. I had read it before, of course, as part of my xenobiology preparation, but I read it again on my personal tablet while sitting in the campus garden surrounded by 8 other species doing their own version of the same anxious scrolling. Homo sapiens. Tier 4 classification. General category. Unremarkable. No venom. No natural armor. No psionic sensitivity. No enhanced sensory capabilities beyond a moderate visual range and a surprisingly strong sense of smell, which the database noted was mostly unused in modern human civilization. Average. Lifespan listed as 70 to 90 standard. Years, bipedal locomotion bilateral. Symmetry, social species prone to. Forming groups. The entry had 3 short paragraphs, a small photograph of a human standing next to a height, reference post, and a footnote that said human physiological data had last been updated 11 years ago. 11 years was a long time for a database entry to go unrevised. I noted that, filed it away, and did not think much of it. I found Mara in the lab the next morning. She was already there when I arrived, which was 8 minutes before the start time, which meant she had arrived at least 9 minutes early. She had a notebook open on the bench beside her, written in a small, dense script I could not read. She had a cup of something hot. She had a granola bar, partially eaten, sitting on the corner of the bench. She looked up when I came in. Her eyes were brown, quiet, focused, the kind of eyes that did not move around a room nervously, but simply rested on whatever they happened to be pointed at. She looked at me the way she had looked at the KAT cadets, not with fear, not with particular friendliness, just with attention. "Yours Axial," she said. Her pronunciation of my name was not perfect, but it was much closer than most non-Vranny managed on a first attempt. "Yes," I said. My translator was running so she would hear my name, M. Tone in standard galactic language, which sounds something like a short formal syllable followed by a rising note. "You are Mara Salas." "Yes," she said in almost exactly the same tone. Then she went back to her notebook. I set my bag down. I arranged my instruments. I looked at my half of the bench and then at her half of the bench and noted that her side was, despite the granola bar, extremely organized. Everything was in a specific place. The notebook was open at a precise angle. The cup was at exactly the distance from her hand that would make it easy to pick up without looking. She was, I realized, someone who always knew where everything was. I did not think much of this either at the time. The first lab session was in Introductory 1. We were categorizing tissue samples from 6 different species, identifying cellular structures, noting regenerative capacity. It was basic work. I had done all of it before in my undergraduate studies. I expected to guide the session gently, since humans were a young space faring species and their medical training was still catching up to coalition standards. Mara had finished her sample analysis before I was halfway through mine. Her notes were exact. Her cellular identification was correct. When I glanced at her work, I found that she had also included 2 observations that were not part of the required analysis, both of which were accurate, and one of which was genuinely interesting. I finished my own samples and did not say anything about this. At the end of the session, Elder Duckett came around to check progress. He paused at our bench, looked at Mara's notes, and then looked at Mara. She was eating the rest of her granola bar. "Good," he said, which was the only word he had used at any bench that morning. He moved on that afternoon in the main corridor. I was present for the incident with the Vorshai. The Vorshai are the second largest species at Orion University by population, and among the most physically imposing after the K. They have a dual skeletal structure, which means they can lock their joints in ways that make them nearly immovable when they choose to stand their ground. And they have a reputation for territorial behavior that the coalition officially describes as culturally Significant social boundary. Maintenance, which is a very polished way of saying they are comfortable, making smaller species feel unwelcome. 3 of them were standing near the cafeteria entrance, occupying the exact center of the corridor, a first-year HL student, young, small, his neck frills still the pale yellow of someone who had not yet fully matured, was trying to get past them. They were not moving. They were watching him try with the kind of lazy attention that predators give to something they have already decided is beneath formal effort. Myra was walking behind me. I had not realized she was there. I had slowed to watch the situation because I was, to be honest, hoping someone with actual authority would appear before it became necessary for me to decide whether to do anything. She walked past me. She did not run. She did not call out. She walked in a straight line to the point in the corridor where the 3 Vorshai were standing, and she stopped. She was not between them and the Havel student. Exactly, she was simply present, standing at a specific angle that I could not immediately categorize. One of the Vorshai looked down at her. His head had to travel a significant distance downward to do so. Mara said something. I was standing too far back to hear it clearly through the corridor noise. My translator picked up only fragments, a few words, steady cadence, no rise in pitch, no aggression markers. The Vorshai's bioluminescent aggression patches, bright orange up to that moment, went dim, not gradually, not slowly. They went dark the way a light goes out when you cut the power. 3 of them moved, not all at once and not quickly, because moving quickly would have looked like flight, but they moved. They found reasons to be elsewhere. Within about 30 seconds, the corridor was clear. Mara looked at the HL student. She said, I think something short and practical, the kind of thing that might translate to something like, go on. Then he went. His neck frills had gone from yellow to a deep, relieved green in the space of those 30 seconds. Mara walked back past me. She had a second granola bar out. I did not know where it had come from. I did not ask what she had said to the Vorshai, partly because I had not yet processed what I had just seen, and partly because something in the angle of her walk, the same steady, unhurried forward motion she always seemed to have, made me feel that asking questions was something I should approach carefully. That evening, I went to find my dormitory neighbor, a Havel elder named Suval, who was in his 4th year at Orion, and who had noticed a quiet encyclopedic knowledge of campus dynamics. I described what I had seen. I asked if he knew anything about Mara Sis. He was quiet for a long moment. He had been arranging dried nutrient leaves in a pattern on his low desk, a meditative habit of his, and he did not stop during the silence. She is from a place called Canada, he said finally. On Earth, a cold place, a lot of forest. That doesn't explain what I saw, I said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He went back to his leaves after a moment. Without looking up, he added, don't ask her about it yet. Let her tell you when she's ready. Why? I asked. He picked up one of the leaves and turned it over. Because you are not ready to hear it yet. I went back to my room. I opened my observation log, which I kept as a personal research habit, noting interesting behavioral data about the species I encountered on campus. Under Maracellus, I typed her name, her species, her planet of origin, and then sat for a while before adding my initial assessment. I wrote appears Non-threatening, no combat modifications. Detected, possibly the least dangerous entity on campus. I looked at it for a moment, then I saved it, closed the log, and went asleep. I did not delete the line that night. That would come later. In the same way, most of the things I thought I knew about humans would come later, slowly, then all at once, and with a feeling that was not quite embarrassment and not quite all, but something that lived in the exact uncomfortable space between them. The restricted archive was not supposed to be easy to access. It was not locked behind anything dramatic, no retinal scan or voice confirmation or sealed gate. It was simply categorized under Xenobiology Deep History, filed at the bottom of a research index that most people never reached because the newer studies were at the top and the search algorithm always pointed you toward the recent work first. I reached the bottom of the index because I was thorough. That was not a virtue I had ever thought would cause me trouble. It started simply enough. After the corridor incident, I had gone back to the Coalition's Xenobiology database on humans and read the 3-paragraph entry again. Then I read it a third time. Then I found myself thinking about the Vorsh's aggression patches going dark, and the way Mara had positioned herself, and the way the HL student's neck frills had gone from panic yellow to relief green in 30 seconds. And I decided that 3 paragraphs were not sufficient. I started with the standard academic index, 42 papers on human physiology, most of them written in the early contact period, most of them focused on what humans lack compared to other species. No natural venom documented 7 times, no psionic sensitivity documented 12 times, with a recurring note that this was unusual for a species that had developed space travel independently. Moderate sensory capability, moderate strength, moderate speed. The word moderate appeared so many times in the human literature that I began to feel it was doing a lot of work. I went deeper. I filled a citation chain from a paper on human metabolic rates into a subsection I had not looked at before, filed under evolutionary history and pre-Kant behavioral records. Most of this was anthropological, the kind of historical study that xenobiologists do not usually bother with, because behavior from 10,000 years ago is rarely relevant to its species. Current campus conduct. I opened it anyway. The first paper was titled Persistence Hunting in Early Homo Sapiens and Its Implications for Endurance Physiology. It was written by a Vithrani field researcher named Cavell, who had spent 8 years on Earth during the early contact period, living among human communities and studying them the way I was now studying my coursework, methodically, with careful notes, and with what I could tell even through the dry academic language was a slowly increasing sense of unease. Cavell described a hunting method that humans had used for most of their evolutionary history before the development of complex ranged weapons. The method was this: a human or group of humans would identify a prey animal, often one many times their own mass, and begin following it, not running at top speed, not attempting to overpower it, just following steadily for hours. The prey animal would flee initially. It was faster than the human. It would put distance between them, but humans are what the paper called a persistence predator, which is a scientific way of saying that they do not stop. Most mammals overheat when they run at full speed for extended periods, humans, sweat, which most other mammals do not do effectively, and this allows them to maintain movement and heat that would slow or stop other species entirely. The prey animal would rest. The humans would not. The prey animal would look back and see the humans still coming, still at the same steady pace, growing no closer but never falling behind, and something in the animal's nervous system, something old and precise and correct, would recognize what was happening. It could not outlast them. Nothing could. Cavell described watching a persistence hunt conducted by a community in southern Africa, a dry landscape with a sun that I gathered was significantly more aggressive than the star above Orion University. The hunters wore minimal covering. They carried simple tools. They ran, if you could call it running, in a rhythm that looked almost casual, a long striding forward motion that was not fast but was absolutely unbroken. The prey animal, a large herd ungulate weighing approximately 500 kg, ran. It rested. It ran again. The humans kept coming. After 3 hours and 40 minutes, the animal stopped. It stood in the heat. Its legs were shaking. It was not injured. It had simply run out of the ability to run any further. The lead hunter walked up to it calmly. The animal did not flee. There was nowhere left to go. I read that paragraph 3 times, then I kept reading. Cavell noted with the strained neutrality of someone trying very hard to remain scientific, that persistence hunting was not an anomaly. It was not a specialized cultural practice. It was a behavior documented across human populations on every inhabited continent, in every climate, in conditions ranging from open plains to dense forest to mountain terrain to environments cold enough to freeze most other species. Blood, he also noted, and this was the part that stayed with me, that many of the communities he studied hunted not because they had to. They had other food sources. They had agriculture and fishing and stored provisions. They hunted in a significant number of documented cases because they wanted to. I closed the paper. I sat in the library, which at this hour of the night was nearly empty. A few solvent students quietly studying in one corner, and a single Cath cadet asleep at a table near the window. And I thought about the 3-paragraph database entry. No venom, no natural armor, no psionic ability, nothing in those 3 paragraphs had mentioned that humans had spent the majority of their evolutionary history following things until the things gave up. I thought about Mara in the corridor, the way she had positioned herself, the way she had not moved. I went back to the index and followed 2 more citation chains, and the more I followed, the more I found not everything in those papers was comfortable reading. There were records of humans tracking prey across terrain that field researchers had rated as impassable by every other species standards. There were notes on human navigation capability in total darkness, using scent and sound and what Cavell described as pattern recognition, so deeply wired into the species' brain structure that it functioned without conscious effort. There was a paper dedicated entirely to the human hand and the specific extraordinary way it was designed for throwing, for the precise launch of objects at high speed and with directional accuracy that exceeded every other species in the coalition. The paper pointed out that the human shoulder was one of the most sophisticated ballistic mechanisms in Known biology, not for hitting things, for throwing things from a distance. With accuracy, the human body had been shaped over millions of years for hunting. I sat with that for a while. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I closed the archive, gathered my notes, walked across campus to the lab, and found Mara because her light was on. And I had seen over the week that she worked late. She was at the bench, notebook open, a fresh cup of something hot, a granola bar. She looked up when I came in, the same quiet, attentive look. Your species used to hunt megafauna, I said. For survival, she nodded. For survival and for other reasons. Other reasons, I said. Sport, she said. Community, skill, practice, respect for the animal. There were a lot of reasons, depending on who you ask and when in history you're looking. You still do, I said. It was not quite a question. Some of us do, she said. Yes, she went back to her notes. I stood for a moment. My amber patches were glowing again. I had not noticed when they had started. I read about persistence hunting, I said. She looked up again. This time there was something in her expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Did you read Cavell? Yes, he got most of it right. She said he was a little romantic about it in places. The reality is less poetic. It's mostly just walking, a lot of walking. You read the ground, you read the animal, you stay steady. She paused. You don't stop, you don't stop, I repeated. That's the whole trick, she said. I went back to my notes that night and added 6 pages to my human entry. The next morning I flagged the entry for secondary review and sent a note to Elder Dates's rear count, asking whether I could schedule conversation about classification, accuracy in the coalition databases. Human file, he replied within the hour, which was unusual for a professor. He said, yes, tomorrow, bring your notes. Then he added below his signature in small text, I wondered when you would start asking. That afternoon in the western wing of the building, I was sitting with 2 other students, reviewing joint coursework when the security alert came in. It was not a full alarm. It was a notification that flashed quietly on the institution screens. Incident reported, North Nature Preserve, advisory only, security responding. I would have thought nothing of it, but Mara came into the room at that exact moment, looked at the screen, looked at the notification, and stopped walking. She stood very still for approximately 2 seconds, then she turned around and went back the way she had come. I did not follow her, not yet, but I made note of the direction she walked, and I thought about what I had read the night before, and I felt in the amber glow of my patches brightening slowly toward something darker, the first real understanding of what I was sitting next to in that laboratory. The database said 3 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs were nowhere near enough. The security notification on the screens had been deliberately vague. I know that now. The administration did not want a campus-wide panic, so they kept the language soft. Incident reported, Northern Nature Preserve, advisory only, no specific details, no numbers, no mention of the Vorshai separatist group that had in the previous 48 hours quietly positioned 6 armed individuals inside the preserve's restricted research zone, taken 1 faculty member hostage, and sent a coded message to the Coalition Security Bureau, demanding political concessions they were never going to receive. I found all of this out by going to Elder Duckett's office. It was late in the afternoon, and the corridor outside his office had 2 campus security personnel standing the entrance to the staff wing, which was not normal. I asked one of them if Elder Duckett was available. He said he would. Jack. He went in, came back out, and held the door open for me with an expression that suggested he was not entirely sure this was wise. Elder Duckett was behind his desk, which was covered in what I now recognized as crisis management printed maps of the preserve, a communication device running on an open channel, and a half-eaten meal that had clearly been set aside hours ago and not returned to. He looked up when I entered. Sit, he said. I sat. He told me what had happened. The faculty member taken was Professor Oren Kai, a solvent researcher who had been conducting soil studies in the north quadrant of the preserve. The group holding him were a faction of Vorsha separatists, 6 individuals armed with standard compact weapons and with detailed knowledge of the preserve's layout because one of their members had worked on the grounds maintenance team the previous year. Coalition Security Bureau is coordinating a response. Elder Duckett said campus security has sealed the preserve's perimeter. They are assessing entry options. He looked at his maps. The terrain is the problem. The preserve's northern quadrant is dense secondary forest, low visibility, significant sound cover. The Vorshai chose it deliberately. Their member who worked here knew which zones had minimal sensor coverage. How long has Professor Oren Kai been in there? I asked. 11 hours, he said. I was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? He looked at me across the desk. Because an hour ago, Mara CIS came to this office and asked for the preserve's topographic maps, the last known patrol routes of the separatists, and whatever behavioral profile we had on their leader. I felt something shift in the room, a change in the quality of the air, as if the conversation had moved on to ground I had not prepared for. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her I did not have authorization to release that information to a student. He paused. She thanked me politely and left. And then he said carefully, approximately 30 minutes later, 2 of the 3 campus security analysts who had been working on the terrain problem came to me separately to report that they had each independently found their workstation briefly accessed and a topographic file opened and closed while they were away from their desks. I looked at the maps on his desk. Then I looked at him. She already has the maps. I said. She has had them for approximately 40 minutes, he said. Security channel on his desk crackled. Voice came through reporting that they had completed their perimeter assessment and were recommending a phased entry through the southwestern corridor, which would take 6 hours to properly route and equip for 6 hours. Professor Oren Kai had already been in there for 11. I asked Elder Duckett where Mara was now. He pointed at one of the preserve's boundary access doors on the map, which was on the campus side of the northern quadrant. The sensor there logged an outward passage 35 minutes ago, he said. It logged only 1 individual. I stood up. I was not entirely sure what I was doing, but I walked to the preserve boundary as fast as I could move without running, because running would have attracted the security personnel's attention, and I had a feeling which I could not explain logically, but which was growing stronger with every step, that the right thing to do was to find the security command post that had been set up near the boundary and watch from there rather than interfere with Whatever was already happening, I was right about the command post. It was a temporary structure near the eastern boundary gate, 3 security officers from different species, communication equipment, a grid monitor showing the preserved sensor network. One of the officers was the campus security chief, a decorated Vorshai veteran named Commander Velcro, who had 4 campaign markers on his uniform and who was when I arrived staring at the sensor grid with an expression I had not seen on a Vorshai before, which was the expression of someone who did not know what they were looking at. He looked at me when I came in. He knew who I was, I think, because he had been briefed on the incident by Elder Jewett. He looked at me, and then he looked back at the grid, and he said nothing. I looked at the grid. There was one signal moving slowly through the northern quadrant. It was Mara's biosignature tag, the standard one issued to all students for emergency tracking, which told me she had not tried to hide her location. She was not sneaking, she was walking. The signal moved at an unhurried, steady pace, heading north and slightly east along a route that followed no path I could see. On the map, she entered without authorization, Commander Velcro said, not angrily, just as a statement of fact. Yes, I said, I have 6 armed separatists in that preserve, he said, and 1 unarmed human student who apparently stole my topographic files. She borrowed them, I said, though I was not sure why I said it. He looked at me. She has no armor, no weapons beyond a field kit and whatever she carries. Personally, my team has been assessing this terrain for 6 hours, and we cannot identify a safe entry route that does not risk the hostage. He paused. She walked in with a notebook. We both looked at the sensor grid. Her signal was still moving, same pace, same steady forward motion. I thought about the paper I had read the night before. The hunters in the heat, the prey animal resting, the hunters still coming, still at the same pace. I thought about what Mara had said, you don't stop, that's the whole trick. One of the other security officers said quietly that 2 of the separatist signals had moved to intercept her. Both signals were moving fast, the way trained individuals move when they are confident in their environment. They close the distance between themselves and Mara's signal on the grid, and then they stopped. Not stopped as in they slowed down and came to a halt. Stopped as in their signals simply ceased to update. They were still there, their biosigns still registering, but they were not moving. Commander Velcro leaned forward over the grid. The security officer monitoring communications said nothing because there was nothing to say. We were watching something happen on a screen that we could not fully explain. 2 experienced separatist fighters, terrain they knew, moving toward one small human woman and then stopping. Their signals were approximately 40 meters from her last confirmed position. Mara's signal kept moving. What did she do? The communications officer asked. Too. No one in particular. No one answered. Her signal curved north, then east, then north again in a gentle arc. I looked at the topographic map overlaid on the grid, and I realized slowly what the arc meant. She was not walking toward the separatists' main position. She was walking around it, a wide, slow circle. She's mapping their movement, I said. Commander Velcro looked at me. She's finding out where they go, I said. She's watching how they respond to her presence. She's reading the ground. I stopped because I was saying things I had only read about in a paper the night before and saying them to a decorated Vorshai security commander who had spent 20 years in active tactical operations. And I was not sure they would land correctly. He looked at the grid for a long moment. She's hurting them, he said. Quietly, his voice was absolutely flat. We watched the third and fourth. Separatist signals became restless, moving in short bursts, changing positions. This was a trained group. They were not panicking, but they were responding to something, adjusting their positions in a pattern that I could see, even on the grid, was slowly compressing toward the northern end of the quadrant. Mara's signal described another arc. Patient, unhurried, the preserved sensor network had limited coverage in the northern quadrant, which was precisely why the separatists had chosen it, but Mara's student biosign kept registering at steady intervals, and through those intervals we could read her direction. She was not closing in quickly, she was closing in the way water closes in on something everywhere at once from every angle that the other thing had not thought to watch. The communications channel opened. A voice came through, rough and tightly controlled, and the translator rendered it in standard. This is the northern team. Request updated. Positions, we have lost visual on 2 elements. Repeat, we have lost visual and contact on elements 3 and 4. Commander Velcro looked at the 2 signals that had stopped moving. He closed the communications channel. He did not respond. I understood then that he had decided something. We waited. The 4th hour came. The preserve was quiet. Outside the command post, night insects singing in the Trian, a cool wind coming from the north. I did not sit down. Commander Velcro did not sit down. The 2 security officers stayed at their stations and watched the grid and said nothing. At the 3-hour and 58-minute mark, a new signal appeared at the preserve's eastern boundary. Professor Orinkai's biosign, moving outward toward us. A minute later, the eastern gate opened. Professor Orinkai came through the gate. He was uninjured. His spine plates were rattling with stress and relief, a solvent physiological response that is impossible to control, and that means something between I thought I was going to die and I can't quite believe I didn't. He sat down on the ground immediately because his legs were not ready to discuss standing any further. One of the security officers went to him. Commander Velcro and I looked at the grid. Mara's signal was moving toward the same gate. Behind her in the preserve, all 6 separatist signals were stationary, not eliminated. Their biosigns were still active. They were simply not moving. The gate opened. Again she came through it, hoodie hair still pulled back, field kit on her shoulder. She was eating a granola bar. There was a small cut on her left forearm just above the wrist, which she appeared to have treated herself with a strip of medical tape from her kit. The cut was the kind you get from moving through dense undergrowth in the dark. She looked at Commander Velcro. 6, she said. All present. The 2 at the eastern section are zip-tied to separate trees. The other 4 are together in the hollow near the northern ridge. Their weapons are disassembled. I stacked the components. She paused. Leader has a left knee issue. Old injury. I didn't have to use it. Commander Velcro was completely still. You disabled 6 armed individuals, he said, in 3 hours and 58 minutes in terrain that my team assessed as operationally unsafe for entry. Your team was doing it as a direct approach problem, she said. it isn't that kind of problem. What kind of problem is it? He asked. She chewed her granola bar thoughtfully. A patient's problem, she said. There was a long silence. Commander Velcro's aggression patches, I noticed, had not gone orange since she had come through the gate. They were neutral gray-green. He had, I realized, instinctively read her the same way the Vorsight cadets in the corridor had read her. His patches had measured something and found the neutral color to be the appropriate one. He was someone who had spent 20 years in tactical operations, and something very old and very accurate in his biology was telling him to be polite. Where? He asked carefully. Did you learn to do that? She took another bite of her granola bar. She looked toward the preserve at the dark tree with the same quiet expression she always wore. Home, she said. The coalition filed a report. I know because Elder Duckett told me 3 days later that the incident file had been closed, that Professor Oren Kai had been cleared by medical, and that the separatist group was in coalition Security Bureau custody. He did not mention Mara's name anywhere in this summary. He said the situation had been resolved through coordinated security response. I looked at him. He looked at me. Coordinated security response. I said, that is what the report says. He said he went back to his nutrient leaves. I went back to my notes. Mara was in the lab the next morning at the same time she always was, which was 8 minutes before start. Her notebook was open at the same angle. Her cup was in the same position. She had a granola bar. The cut on her forearm was healing, covered now with the standard medical tape, and she had apparently decided it was not worth discussing because she did not bring it up. I sat down at my bench and looked at my instruments and thought about how to begin. Are you all right? Said. She looked up. Yes, the cut on your arm. She glanced at it briefly. Blackthorn, she said. There was a patch of it near the eastern hollow. I should have seen it earlier. Blackthorn, I said. Sharp shrub. Native to Europe originally, but it seeds itself everywhere. My fault for moving too fast through that section. She wrote something in her notebook. It's an LT Unc and GT. Fine. I opened my own notebook. I looked at the week's lab assignment. I thought about what I was going to say next. You knew the terrain would give you the advantage, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Partially, she said. Dense forest with poor sensor coverage meant they couldn't rely on equipment that levels things in that kind of environment. Whoever reads the ground better has the edge, and you read the ground better. I've been reading ground since I was 7 years old, she said, not as a boast, as a statement, the way you state a fact about whether you're home in Canada. I said. My family hunted, she said. My grandmother hunted. It goes back a long way. She paused. Up there in that kind of country, you learn early that the forest will tell you everything you need to know if you're willing to listen. Most people aren't patient enough. I thought about what I had read about the long arc of human history, the millions of years of reading terrain and following signs and staying steady. I thought about persistence, about not stopping. Can I ask you something personal? I said. She looked up. You can ask. Freight in the preserve. She was quiet for longer this time. She looked at her notebook, then out the lab's narrow window at the campus garden, where a few solvent students were moving between plants in the early morning light. Not of them, she said. Then what were you afraid of? She was still for a moment. There was something in her expression that was more open than I had seen before, a small shift in the quality of her attention, as if she had decided that this particular question deserved a real answer rather than a short one, enjoying it too much. She said it quietly and without drama, the way she said most things. I looked at her. She had gone back to her notebook. She was writing in her small, dense script, the pen moving at the same steady pace it always moved. I understood then that what she had just told me was not a casual comment. It was something she had thought about seriously, something she monitored in herself with the same careful attention she gave to everything else. She was not simply a skilled person who had done a necessary thing. She was someone who understood what she was precisely and without illusion, and who had made choices about how to live with that understanding. That was, I found, more interesting than any of the tactical details. Late that morning I went to Elder Jewitz's office and told him I was formally requesting a complete reclassification review of the coalition database's human entry. I put my 6 pages of notes on his desk along with citations from the deep archive, along with a summary of the Cavill research, along with my own behavioral observations. He read through it without interrupting. When he was done, he sat back and looked at me for a long moment. How many subpages? He asked. 14, I said, with more to add. I have not finished the pre-Kant behavioral records. He nodded slowly. He looked at the notes again, then he picked up his communication device and sent a message to someone which he showed me after. Request to the Coalition Xenobiology Standards Board for a priority review. Flag on the Homo sapiens classification. Entry, reason cited as significant evidential gap in current documentation. The reply came back in under an hour. It said review approved, priority status granted. I had never seen a priority review granted in under an hour. Those things usually took weeks. Someone else has been watching the humans, Elder Duckett said, looking at his screen. This is not the first flag request this year. He said it thoughtfully, as if he was not entirely surprised. I returned to the lab and spent the afternoon working on the classification notes. Mara left at her usual time, which was precisely 40 minutes after the formal end of the lab session, not a minute before and not a minute after. She nodded to me on her way out. She had a granola bar. 2 days later, a small quiet event happened in the main corridor near the cafeteria entrance. The 3 Vorshai cadets who had cornered the young Havel student the first week were standing near the same spot where that incident had occurred. The Havel student was passing through. One of the Vorshai cadets stepped aside unprompted and made room. Then the second one did, then the third. The HL student passed through. No one said anything. There was no explanation given, no formal announcement. It simply happened. I asked around quietly and could not find any event that had caused this change. No complaint had been filed. No administrator had spoken to the KE or the Vorshai groups about their conduct. No new policy had been issued. Something had simply shifted in the informal understanding of campus social dynamics, and the shift pointed in a specific direction, and that direction was connected somehow to a quiet human woman in a gray hoodie who was almost never the loudest person in a room and was almost never the most visible person in a corridor, and was most of the time simply eating a granola bar and writing in her notebook. I did not try to map the connection too precisely. I was a xenobiologist. I understood that some things were better documented than explained. Nuns exchange students arrived on a bright morning 2 weeks after the preserve incident. I watched them from the window of the lab because the arrival day always involved a lot of species I had not seen before, and old habits of observation are hard to lose. There were Sullivan students, a small group of K younglings looking wider than their species usually allowed themselves to appear, several HL students in their travel robes, and a cluster of Vorshei arrivals who were moving through the crowd with a confident territorial manner of their kind. One of the young Vorshei pointed toward the vending machines. I looked. Myra was there, hoodie, granola bar, not looking at anyone, watching the middle distance with her usual quiet attention. That one, the young Vorshei said. His voice was carrying because young Vorshei generally did not concern themselves with volume. She's harmless, look at her. Just standing there. His companion laughed, which is a sound in Vorshei that is less like laughter and more like the rapid clicking of bones. I turned away from the window. I thought about saying something. I thought about what I could say, how I could frame it, how I might deliver in a sentence or two what had taken me 3 weeks and 14 pages of notes to begin to understand. I thought about the KFL field research and the corridor and the preserve and the sensor grid and 6 stationary biosigns and disassembled weapons stacked neatly in a forest hollow. I thought about what Mara had said, you don't stop, that's the whole trick. I thought about what Elder Suval had told me on my first week, you are not ready to hear it yet. That was the thing about humans. Understanding did not come quickly, because nothing about them suggested it was necessary. They moved at an ordinary pace. They did not display aggression. They ate granola bars and wrote in notebooks and spoke in quiet voices and made room for other species without demanding acknowledgement of the gesture. They gave every impression at first glance and second glance and even third glance of being exactly what the database said they were: moderate, unremarkable. 3 paragraphs. The understanding came later. It crept through the back of your observations, in the moments when you noticed a small thing that did not quite fit the category you had assigned, and then another small thing, and then a third. And then one evening you were sitting in a library reading about persistence hunting, and you felt something change in your understanding of what you were looking at, and after that, once you had seen it, you could not unsee it. Let them learn, I thought, in their own time. The way I had learned, I went back to my notes. Mara would still be at the vending machine when the young Vorsha walked past her. She would not look at him. She would not make a sound. She would simply be there eating her granola bar, aware of everything around her in the quiet, total way that her species had spent millions of years perfecting. He would not know what he was walking past. He would find out eventually. They all did. I had 40 pages of notes on humans by this point, with citations, field observations, behavioral analysis, a pending priority reclassification with the Coalition Standards Board, and a conversation with Mara that I replayed sometimes in the evenings when I was trying to make sense of what the species actually was. The notes kept growing. They had a way of doing that every time I thought I had reached a complete picture. Something small would happen, some quiet, undramatic moment, and I would have to open the document and add Another paragraph. That night I was working late and Mara was still in the lab, which was not unusual. It was close to midnight station time. The campus outside was quiet. The building had that particular late-night atmosphere that exists in research spaces everywhere, a kind of focused, unhurried stillness, broken only by the sounds of people who are too interested in their work to leave. We had not been talking. Mara did not need to fill silence. It was one of the things I had noted about her early on and had since come to find comfortable, because Vithrani are also capable of extended companionable silence, and most other species are not. I was working on a metabolic comparison study, trying to reconcile a data point in my human notes with 3 other papers that said something slightly different about human thermorelation. I asked without looking up whether she knew anything about the variance in sweat gland distribution between different human populations. She answered for about 4 minutes with more detail than I expected, and what she said resolved my data conflict entirely. I updated my notes. I looked up after a moment and found her watching me with an expression I had seen once or twice before, a kind of quiet consideration, as if she was deciding something. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," I said. "What does your amber color mean?" She nodded toward my neck where my bioluminescent patches run. I had not realized they were amber. I checked. They were. "Caution," I said. "Alertness. It is the color I display when I am in an unfamiliar situation, or when I am not sure what to expect." "You've been amber since we started the semester," she said. Not unkindly. I thought about that. "Yes," I said. "Are you still worried about the campus?" she asked. "About the other species?" "Less than I was," I said. Honestly. Then I paused because something in the conversation wanted to be said, and I was not sure how to say it without it sounding strange. "I think I was amber about you, partly in the beginning." She nodded as if this was a reasonable thing to say. "And now?" she asked. I thought about it. My patches were amber, still not bright as soft amber, the kind I displayed in a late night lab session when everything was quiet and familiar, and I was focused on work I found genuinely interesting. "Now, I think it is more like respect," I said. "My species does not have a different color for respect. It reads the same as caution. We are a careful species." She looked at me for a moment. "That's very honest," she said. "I'm trying to be a good xenobiologist," I said. Something in her expression shifted, and for a moment I saw something that was not the quiet steadiness she usually presented to the world. It was something warmer, more personal. "You are," she said, and then in a tone that was lighter than her usual, "you're the first person who's done proper research. Most people just look at the database entry." "The database entry is 3 paragraphs," I said. "Yes." She said. "It is inadequate." Dramatically, she said. We both went back to our work. The lab was quiet. Somewhere outside the campus, night insects were doing their thing. A few buildings over, someone was running a late equipment calibration, the low hum of it just barely audible through the walls. I thought about the Vorche younglings who had arrived that morning, and the first-year students who were somewhere on campus right now, eating late dinners or reviewing their orientation documents or looking up the database entries on their new classmates. Some of them would already have looked up humans. They would have read 3 paragraphs. They would have thought moderate unremarkable. They would in their own time begin to notice things that did not quite fit. I was glad in a way I could not entirely explain that I would be on this campus to watch that process happen. It was, from a purely xenobiological standpoint, one of the most interesting things I had ever had the chance to document. I have spent the past year adding to my notes. The reclassification request went through the Coalition Standards Board and is now in formal review, which means a team of senior xenobiologists from 6 species are currently reading everything I submitted, and if the tour message from the board's administrative coordinator is any indication, having a complicated morning about it, Elder Duckett told me last week that the board had sent a follow-up request for additional behavioral documentation, specifically regarding human social dynamics in multi-species competitive environments. He handed me the message and then looked at me with the expression he has when he already knows the answer to something, but is being courteous enough to let the other person discover it first. I told him I had 42 pages of documentation on that subject specifically. He said, "Good, Mara leaves at the end of the year. She will have completed her graduate coursework. She will go back to Earth for a period," she told me once, briefly to visit her family. After that, she is apparently considering a field research posting in the outer systems, which strikes me as either an excellent or a very concerning development, depending on which direction you're thinking about it from. The campus will continue, new students will arrive, KTH will walk through the corridors, the Vorshai will test boundaries, new species will look at the vending machines and see a quiet human girl in a gray hoodie and think, harmless. I have considered more than once whether I should do something about this, post a notice, add a footnote to the orientation materials, slip a copy of Cavel's paper under the doors of the first-year dormitories. I have decided not to, not because the information isn't important. It is not because I don't care about the new students' education. I do, but because there is something in the process of learning it yourself, in the slow accumulation of small observations that don't quite fit. In the evening in the library, when the pieces come together and you feel the floor of your understanding shift, that cannot be replaced by simply being told. It has to be discovered. It works on you differently when you discover it yourself. Besides, Mara is perfectly capable of teaching the lesson herself, in her own way, in her own time too. Whoever needs to learn it, she is very patient. She does not stop. That is, as she once told me, the whole trick. I sat in the lab last night after everyone else had gone home, adding another paragraph to my notes, when Mara looked up from her bench and said without any particular preamble, "You know, memorized every exit from this building, right?" I looked up. "Old habit," she said. "From hunting." I said she considered this. "From being careful," she said. "There. The same thing mostly." She went back to her notes. My patches glowed their soft, familiar amber. Outside, the campus was quiet. The stars above the orbital platform were doing what they always do, burning steadily, indifferent to everything below them. I have studied 38 species. I have read papers on creatures that could dismantle a city block. I have walked the same corridors as Keth cadets and Vorshai tacticians, and species older than my civilization by factors I find genuinely humbling. I have never in my entire career been as interested in any of them as I am in the One sitting across the lab bench from me, writing in a small dense script, eating a granola bar, quietly aware of everything. The database says 3 paragraphs. I have over 40 pages now and I am still not finished. I do not think I will ever be finished. That I have come to understand is exactly as it should.